The Akkadian period, from about 2350 to 2150 BCE, was a time of great innovation in many different aspects of life. The kings of ancient Mesopotamia and their officials were trying new ways of governing. Contacts with distant lands introduced exotic goods and new ideas. Artisans and craftsmen experimented with more naturalistic depictions of humans and the natural world. And authors wrote about the gods with new emotion and devotion. This was a classical period for the arts in Mesopotamia. The Akkadian Empire's capital, city of Agade, must have been an impressive place. A later literary text describes it as having been almost impossibly wealthy. We're told that the dwellings were filled with gold. Its bright, shining houses were filled with silver. Into its granaries were brought copper, lead, and slabs of lapis lazuli. Its silos bulged at the sides. Its wharfs, where the boats docked, were all a-bustle. The boats it mentions were from many places, including distant lands. There were boats from Dilmun, modern-day Bahrain, bringing copper, ivory, tin, and timber. From Magan, modern-day Oman, came copper and an igneous rock known as diorite for sculpture. The boats from Meluha, the Indus Valley, brought pearls, carnelian, and silver, along with, amazingly, elephants, monkeys, and water buffalo. It would have been a sight to see those animals on board. South Asian water buffalo show up in the designs on cylinder seals from the Akkadian period. The Akkadian artists had definitely seen these foreign animals. Perhaps they were symbols of their faraway homeland. Having access to exotic foreign goods was a way to demonstrate your wealth and power. We see Mesopotamian kings doing this for centuries to follow. Many people living within the empire, people like soldiers, traders, and administrators, would have been exposed to new ideas, new fashions, new languages, even new and surprising animals. One thing that probably made an impression on them was the difference in the religious beliefs they encountered. But they didn't conclude that the foreign beliefs were false. When Mesopotamians met people who worshipped different gods from them, they assumed that these were real gods too. They just hadn't known about them before. Some of the gods might be useful and could be absorbed into their own culture and worshipped. Others were evidently the same gods they already worshipped, but under different names. For example, there's only one sun, so, logically, there's only one sun god. The Sumerians called him Utu, and the Akkadians called him Shamash, and the Egyptians called him Re or Ra, but he was the same god. A lot of the Mesopotamian gods had a Sumerian name and a separate Akkadian name, just as the classical Greek gods also had Roman names. There weren't any false gods in the Mesopotamian view of things, not just in Mesopotamia, but anywhere. Everyone's gods were real. Some were more powerful than others, but even the most powerful ones weren't all-powerful or all-knowing, omnipotent or omniscient. The sun god, for example, knew about everything he could see, but he couldn't see what happened at night. The king of the gods, Enlil, could try to bring a flood to wipe out humans, but he could be fooled by another god who let some humans live. A kind god could keep you healthy for much of your life, but a mean or angry god could make you sick. The safest way to live was to believe in all of the gods, and to give offerings and to say prayers to the ones with the biggest impact on your life. If you moved to a distant land, or even traveled through a land with different gods, the obvious thing was to worship those gods along with your own. It's not that the Mesopotamians tolerated other religions. It's that they didn't recognize that there were other religions. All religious beliefs were part of the same divine world in their view. In fact, they didn't even have a word for religion. They had no way to conceptualize religion as something different from the rest of life. The gods were completely interwoven into everything that people experienced, felt, or thought about. They provided the explanation for every phenomenon in nature. This all made a lot of sense. The evidence of their eyes told them that there were many gods. You could see some of them and witness their great power. The sun rose every morning, defying gravity, illuminating the world, and clearly having a life force that carried it across the sky. The moon did the same at night. Storms gathered and raged and thundered. Water sprang directly out of the ground and made the plants grow. These forces moved just as obviously as a human or a sheep or a cow moved. To the Mesopotamian mind, they were clearly alive. They were also clearly immortal. Back through as many generations as one could imagine, the sun, moon, rains, and so on had always been there and would continue on long after every person alive then had died. They were enormously powerful as well, much more so than any puny human. If a god wanted to wipe out your crop, he could do it in so many ways. He could dry up your irrigation canals, or send a plague of insects, or a flood. You had no choice but to suffer through this, pleading to the gods for their mercy. So the Mesopotamians were obviously not in charge of the universe, the gods were. And if the people's job was to take care of the gods' needs, as they believed, well, that's what they would do. Their religion wasn't about spirituality or heaven or righteousness. It was about keeping the gods happy and living to see another day. But this doesn't mean that the Mesopotamians were especially pessimistic or glum. They actually loved banquets and parties, and they had close friendships and loving families. They had something of a carpe diem attitude, and they made sure to make the best of things. Part of this attitude seems to have included an appreciation for beautiful art, such as elaborate textiles and jewelry. The quality of art and craftsmanship changed considerably during the time of the Akkadian Empire. Before Sargon's time, Sumerian art of the early dynastic period, around 2900 to 2350 BCE, was initially highly stylized. Stone statues were blocky and squat. The figures had large pointed noses and big staring eyes that were usually inlaid with dark stones. The male and female figures were shown dressed in skirts or cloaks of sheepskins that were carved from the stone in a geometric pattern of regular loops. Male figures were often shown bald and clean-shaven. Female figures often wore large hats. Relief sculptures of that early era had these same characteristics. The artists don't seem to have been aiming for naturalism. Instead, they had mastered a distinct style to represent the human form, and they used it widely. At least at the beginning of the era, the faces and bodies were all much the same, though they changed the figures' hairstyles and clothing. And the people probably didn't all have such enormous noses. That was just how artists portrayed them. Still, you couldn't tell from the art if someone was old or young, thin or fat, tall or short. During the early dynastic period, reliefs, mosaics, and even scenes on cylinder seals were organized in registers, with the figures standing or walking along a line that marked the bottom of the scene. Here again, there seems to have been a standard formula for portraying offering givers, soldiers, and so on. But artists during the Akkadian period broke with these traditions. It would be fascinating to know what inspired them. The artwork made during this period is seen as some of the finest of any Mesopotamian era. But we don't even know who the artists were. The identity of an artist himself was unimportant. What was important was the king who commissioned his work, or the god whom it was designed to appeal to. Broadly speaking, the Mesopotamians don't seem to have thought about art in the same ways that we do. It wasn't for self-expression or decoration, and although it might have been inspiring, it was for different reasons. Art seems to have been somewhat magical to the Mesopotamian mind. A representation of a person or a god was called an image, which was tsalmu in Akkadian, and it took on some part of the thing it depicted, almost as though it had captured a bit of the person's soul. Think of it this way. Mesopotamians had no photographers or portrait painters. They probably had little idea of what they looked like. The wealthy had mirrors made of obsidian, but most people would have seen themselves only as reflected in water. So to take an inorganic material such as stone, clay, or bronze and turn it into something that looked human, maybe that was a miraculous thing. In sculpting the rock or the clay into a human figure, the artist gave it a kind of life. A ritual called opening of the mouth completed this transformation. So just as a statue of a god kept in the god's temple was the god, a statue of a king or even a commoner was in some way part of that person. A statue of a man or woman set up in front of a statue of a god could pray to the god on the person's behalf. We know this because of inscriptions on the statues. A lot of the early dynastic sculptures with those big eyes and noses were depicted with their hands in the position of prayer. They had been placed in temples to pray for the lives of the people they represented and for their families. A statue of a king could act on the king's behalf as well. Like a statue of a commoner, it could be set up in a temple to pray to the gods for the king's well-being. Many royal statues were in temples and received offerings, but the statue could also help the king rule, enforcing his power, making sure the people obeyed him. Kings set up their statues around their kingdoms for this reason, not just to remind their subjects that they existed and ruled, but as part of their system of maintaining power. Kings even sent statues of themselves to their allies and to their vassals for the same reason. King Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, had a treaty with another king in the east, and part of that treaty required his ally to put Naram-Sin's statues into his own temples. They helped Naram-Sin establish a presence in the distant land. This seems crazy to us because obviously a statue can't act. It can't force people to pay taxes or punish them if they plot a rebellion. But if the people and the king both believe the statue has power, that it has a part of the king's spirit inside it, then in a way it works. Perhaps the people would be less likely to rebel if they believed the statue was watching them. In later eras, and possibly during the Akkadian period as well, people swore oaths in front of the statue of a king, just as they did in front of statues of gods, and they believed they'd be punished if they broke their oath. It's a bit like witchcraft. If everyone in a society believes that witchcraft is real, then it becomes a way to explain things and a way to deal with enemies. Scientists have assured us, of course, that powers of witchcraft don't exist. But if everyone in a society believes in them, then they seem to be real. Suppose you had a run of bad luck. Someone might be bewitching you. You want to get revenge on someone who treated you badly? Try bewitching him or her. Of course, we know that spells would have done nothing at all. But people always randomly got sick and had accidents, and these could be attributed to the success of the witchcraft. These types of coincidences proved it to be real in their minds, and the Mesopotamians definitely believed that witchcraft was real. So in the same way, if you betrayed the king after swearing to support him, and then something bad happened to you, it could be seen as cause and effect. The Mesopotamians certainly believed this about the gods. There are many prayers that survive in which people beg to have their illnesses taken away or their bad luck improved. They believed that their difficult situation resulted from the gods' anger at some perceived crime, and that only the gods could remedy things. In any event, let's go back to talk about the statues that were made in the Akkadian era. There had been an important technological breakthrough around this time, the invention of what's known as the lost wax technique of bronze casting, in which molten metal is poured into a mold formed from a wax model. Under this process, a clay core was covered with wax and sculpted to the shape of the desired object. Then the core and the wax sculpture were encased in another layer of clay and baked in a kiln. Now the wax melted and was poured out, and molten copper was added. When the metal cooled, it had assumed the shape of the wax model inside the clay shell, and the clay shell was then chipped away. The sculpture was hollow, and much lighter than a solid copper object of the same size would have been. So it could be larger too. The earliest lost wax sculptures in the world were made in Mesopotamia. Some really extraordinary sculptures began to be created. They tend to be referred to as bronzes, though strictly speaking, they were copper alloys. Bronze is made of 10% tin or zinc, and that wasn't true of these early sculptures. Instead, they were made of copper mixed with arsenic, but for convenience, I'll call them bronzes. Akkadian sculptors were able to make bronzes that were much more naturalistic than the early dynastic sculptures had been. And they managed the same naturalism when carving in stone, which is remarkable because stone is much, much harder to carve than the wax that was sculpted to make a bronze. A regal bronze head of a king is probably the best known piece from this era. We don't know which king it was, perhaps Menishtushu, who ruled from about 2269 to 2255 BCE, or Naram Sin, who ruled after him. Unfortunately, there's no inscription to tell us. But no private citizen would have been in a position to commission this type of object. We know that this bronze king isn't a god because there are no horns on his head, and the way his hair is braided into a chignon and the band that he wears above his forehead, those are characteristic of kings of the time. Unlike earlier Sumerian sculptures, this one seems to have been an attempt to portray a real man with his detailed hair and beard, smooth skin, and realistic and determined expression. It's almost life-size and would have had inlaid eyes made of stone. The eyes were gouged out at some point, perhaps to prevent the statue from seeing. Quite a few statues suffered aggressive mutilations in the ancient past. Taking off a statue's head would have taken away its power, so there are a lot of headless statues. Other bronze statues from this time also reflect careful observations of reality. One is a large statue from King Naram Sin's time. It shows a standard bearer sitting on the ground with his bare legs bent comfortably around the pole of his standard. The bones and muscles are almost visible right beneath the skin. His toes curl naturally. Only the bottom half of the sculpture survives, but it gives you a sense of what the artists of this time could achieve. It's been estimated that when the statue was complete, it would have weighed 440 pounds. And all that copper had to be imported, as there was no source for it in Mesopotamia. Artists were just as attentive in their creations of stone sculptures. There's a truly extraordinary statue of Menishtushu wearing a long plain skirt. Unfortunately, the whole top of the king's body and his head are missing, but the skirt seems to be swaying with his movement. The soft folds have been carved perfectly naturalistically, curving around his legs. This was achieved in spite of the fact that the statue is carved from one of the hardest stones, diorite. Diorite is a black rock imported from the region of ancient Magan, and it shines dramatically when polished. Several statues of Menishtushu are similar in quality and also made of diorite. The king bragged in his inscriptions about his campaign to acquire it. The statues erected in his honor were an important reason why he needed it. The artists of this time could sometimes even dispense with the straight registers that carved figures normally rested upon. A victory stele of King Naram Sin that's now in the Louvre Museum is an example of this, and it's unlike anything that came before it. Naram Sin is depicted as by far the biggest figure, and he couldn't look any more heroic. He's this muscular giant striding up a mountain, carrying his bow and arrow, stepping over the naked bodies of defeated enemies. And there's a detail to his helmet that might escape you, but it would have made a big impression on a viewer at the time. There are horns on it. This was how Mesopotamians identified gods in their artwork. They had horned helmets. So Naram Sin was saying that he was a god. He actually was deified. We know this from other sources. And that had never happened before in Mesopotamia. Supposedly, according to legend, the people made him become a god. In this sculpture, there are no ground lines, no parades of identical soldiers. The Akkadian soldiers are shown making their way up a hill, led by Naram Sin himself, climbing over the bodies of dead enemies. The artist must have observed models to get the poses right, and capture the chaos of the scene. A couple of the figures are even looking back over their shoulders as they walk away. So we've seen how adventurous artists making large sculptures were, but the makers of cylinder seals were also breaking new ground at this time. Cylinder seals were very small, usually only an inch or two high, and had to be made meticulously. Tiny figures were carved carefully in relief and laid out so that the scene exactly filled the cylindrical surface, sometimes even including minute details of faces and muscles. These seals were carved with the most creative and eye-catching images of boats, goats and their herdsmen, oxen, mythical scenes, and so on. The Akkadian artists seem to have been particularly interested in scenes of intense struggle, often between heroes and animals or monsters. And they often included inscriptions written in reverse, that is, in mirror writing, so that when rolled on clay, the inscriptions turned out the right way. These gave the name of the owner of the seal and his titles. In later periods, artists made cylinder seals that were more formulaic, choosing from a much smaller repertoire of scenes. It's as though the artists of the Akkadian period were pushing themselves to see what was possible. Presumably, the statues of gods that resided in temples would have been just as finely made as the other artworks in this era, but none of them survive. These cult statues were believed to be the gods, not just images of them. In fact, there are almost no surviving cult statues from any period of Mesopotamian history. One possible exception is a marble female head that had been made back in the Uruk period, between about 3500 and 2900 BCE. Her eyes, eyebrows, and hair would have been inlaid with precious materials, but these are now missing. Still, we can guess what the cult statues looked like because the images of the gods on cylinder seals probably look much the way the gods' statues looked. They suggest that the gods were slightly taller than humans, seated on thrones and wearing horned helmets. They would have been made of gold and other valuable metals and stones and dressed in fine garments. Presumably they don't survive because they were all melted down in later times when the gods were no longer worshipped. The Akkadian period is also when we get our first glimpses of the myths and legends that inspired the Mesopotamians. We know about these literary works because apprentice scribes copied the stories down in school. Probably a lot of them were simply passed down orally and don't survive. Literacy was limited, and people who could read and write used their skill to write letters and record taxes and rations, draw up contracts and so on. They didn't write fictional stories or diaries. It never seems to have occurred to them to do so. But in school, apprentice scribes practiced all kinds of different types of writing, including literature. The world's first author comes from this time period. This was Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon, who became high priestess of the moon god. She wrote hymns and identified herself as their author, something that hadn't been done before. The writers of previous hymns, myths, and legends were all anonymous. But Enheduanna didn't put her name on the cover page, so to speak. She was part of the action of the hymn. For example, in one poem, she wrote this: "Yes, I took up my place in the sanctuary dwelling. I was high priestess, I, Enheduanna. I am Enheduanna, let me speak to you in prayer, my tears flowing like some sweet intoxicant." There are some interesting things here, beyond the fact that Enheduanna had a striking and emotional writing style. One is that she clearly was very powerful. A lesser priestess probably wouldn't have used her name over and over in a hymn. And curiously, the 3 hymns attributed to her aren't directed to the god she served, the moon god. They're addressed to the deity that her family seems to have been particularly dedicated to, the goddess Inanna, who was also known by her Akkadian name, Ishtar. Enheduanna seems to have turned to Inanna in a time of crisis. She wrote in the hymn that a man named Lugal-Ane was the source of her problems. "When Lugal-Ane stood paramount, he expelled me from the temple. He made me fly out the window like a swallow. I had had my taste of life. He made me walk a land of thorns. He took away the noble diadem of my holy office." What in the world is this all about? Well, it's clear there was a political dimension to it. Enheduanna came in as an outsider, so she might have had to deal with considerable resistance within the temple. This particular individual, Lugal-ane, tried to drive her out of the office of high priestess. Perhaps there was also a rebellion in the city of Ur against Akkadian rule. Enheduanna was, of course, associated with her father, Sargon, so she might have been rejected by the people at the time of such a rebellion. Typically for this era, Enheduanna would have seen her difficulties as the gods' doing rather than as an act of the people. Maybe she had to go into exile, so she prayed to the goddess Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of war and love, to help her. And according to the hymn, Inanna came through for her. By the end of the composition, things had apparently been sorted out. Someone wrote that the almighty queen who presides over the priestly congregation, she accepted her prayer. This means that the goddess responded to Enheduanna's prayer. The text continues, Inanna's sublime will was for her restoration to her position in the temple. In spite of the successes of the Akkadian Empire and the cultural heights it attained, the empire was not destined to last. Instead, it would collapse after just a few generations. But that's a story for another day.